Why does evil exist? And specifically, why is it the case that so many evil people seem to be rich and successful, while so many good people seem to be poor and downtrodden and oppressed? What we're going to do is we're going to look at the problem of the success of evil people from the perspective of philosophy. We're going to be looking at it from the perspective of biblical law and also from the perspective of physics. My name is Zachary Strong, and I am a physicist, psychology researcher, philosopher, and biblical scholar. And I've spent several years investigating and wrestling with the problem of evil. And what I'm going to share with you today, I think is going to be quite interesting. And there's going to be kind of a practical side to this in terms of what you can do to fight evil in the world. So what we're going to do is we're going to start off with a philosophical angle. So you might be wondering, why is it that so many people are rich and successful who happen to be evil, right? When we look at what's happened with the Epstein files, it seems that a lot of really rich and powerful people were involved in some despicable, reprehensible, disgusting things. And so far, no one really seems to be facing any consequences. And also, when we think of, business, like I'm a business person by trade, when we think of business, it tends to be people who don't always do business ethically. It seems that they end up ahead. So, what's going on with that, right? So, what we're going to do is we're going to start off with a philosophical look at this issue. And the main source that I'm going to use for this is Atlas Shrugged, which is a book by Ayn Rand. Some people love her, some people hate her. But Atlas Shrugged is a very interesting book. Because essentially what she did with this book was she wrote a story. She wrote her philosophy in a story. And in the story, the United States of America basically becomes communist. And in response to that, the powerful people, the inventors, the business owners, basically the CEOs and founders of companies, they start disappearing. They start disappearing. And the book partially is a mystery story to figure out, where did all these CEOs go? Where did all these inventors go? And artists, like, where did they all go? Why did they all just disappear, you know? And essentially what she's laying out in Atlas Shrugged is this philosophy of not engaging with evil. So it turns out that the working title for Atlas Shrugged was called The Strike. And without going into too many details, what happened in the book is, in response to the exploitation of the inventors and the artists and everything, in response to their exploitation, they simply stopped inventing, stopped doing art, at least publicly. They essentially went on strike, which is it's a fun inversion of the concept of a strike, because usually the people who go on strike are the workers and, the blue collar types and the teachers, especially the teachers. They love going on strike. So usually it's the lower level workers of a company that go on strike. But what she did was basically ask the question, what if all the inventors and the CEOs and the people running industries and so on, what if they went on strike? What would happen to the economy in the country? So essentially what she's laying out is this philosophy of non-engagement. The philosophy is basically, if you're not going to treat me fairly, if you're not going to honor my inventions, if you're not going to honor patents and other intellectual property laws, and you're just going to expropriate and nationalize my company, I'm not going to start the company. I'm not going to give you anything to work with. And in a lot of cases, those inventors and so on, they went on to work menial jobs. Like, they became the blue collar workers. They just stopped inventing. They stopped giving people access to their brilliance. Okay? And so that's kind of the philosophy that's talked about in Atlas Shrugged, which is basically non-engagement. It's, if you people aren't going to do business fairly, if you're going to nationalize my company, if you're going to steal my intellectual property and nationalize that, I'm not going to invent anything to begin with. I'm not going to give you anything. Now, interestingly, as far as I can tell, looking at the last 100 years of history, this is actually the correct and most effective approach. Right now, if you look at our culture, we're engaged in this culture war of liberals versus conservatives and so on. But non engagement with things you don't agree with is actually the most effective approach. Um, One example of this is Bud Light. You might remember a few years ago, Bud Light had a certain controversy in terms of someone that they hired to be a spokesperson for their brand. And the conservative leaning customer base of Bud Light looked at what they were doing and basically said, no, we're not buying your beer anymore. Okay, we're going to go to Coors Light or whatever, right? They stopped buying the beer. And the consequence of that, of course, was that sales of Bud Light cratered and Bud Light was forced to their reevaluate their, way of doing business and what they were up to, right? And so withdrawing your support, withdrawing your intellectual labor, withdrawing your inventions, withdrawing your engagement from things you don't agree with is actually the best way to create change because it forces consequences. Forces consequences. Now, other examples of this that I've seen include veganism. So vegans, a lot of people who are vegan will cite the cruelty in the animal industry. And they'll say, hey, like these animals aren't being treated properly with the factory farming methods and stuff. I don't want to partake in this. Right? And a lot of people who are meat eaters will make fun of them for it or whatever. But essentially what vegans are doing is engaging in the philosophy of non-engagement. They're saying, we don't like how this industry operates. We're not going to give it any money. We're going to eat soybeans instead, or, chickpeas, and, we'll get our protein another way, through beans and so on. So philosophy of non-engagement, that's one example. Another example that I've seen is in the TTRPG industry, because I'm a TTRPG designer. There's generally a philosophy of non-engagement with anything that comes from AI. That industry, generally, people prioritize products made by humans, written by humans, illustrated by humans. And if you're working with AI and illustrating with AI and so on, a lot of people just won't touch your product. And that's just another example of, hey, we don't like how AI is operating. We think it might be stealing from artists and so on, taking their jobs, etc. We're not going to engage with it. And those kinds of collective decisions can shape an industry. They can shape an industry. And so those are just some examples of the philosophy of non-engagement that Ayn Rand advocated for in Atlas Shrugged. Now, to bring this back to the problem of evil, why is it that so many evil people are successful? Why is it that evil people seem to be rich and powerful and so on? It's partially because, collectively, society has not withdrawn their support from those people sufficiently. So, let's say there's a politician and you find out that the politician has been lying or the politician has been corrupt or whatever, right? People will still go and vote for that politician for whatever reason. And I'll give you an example of this. So Kamala Harris and some other politicians on the Democrat side were rather involved in jailing people, specifically black people, at, rather high rates. A number of politicians on the Democrat side were participants in the prison industrial complex that affects black people in the United States. However, they still got the black vote. Right? It's like, what is that? You're rewarding certain kinds of behavior and saying, hey, you know what? You did these things, this was your policy and so on, but we'll still support you. Right? And then people wonder, why are evil people so rich and successful? It's because you haven't withdrawn your support. You haven't withdrawn your support and said, hey, we're not voting for you, get a new candidate. who doesn't have this history of oppressing black people and jailing them and so on. So that's one example. And it happens a lot in politics. It happens a lot in politics where, politicians have a certain history, a certain policy history, and so on. And people still vote for them because, oh, they're a member of the Democrat Party or they're a member of the Republican Party. I got to vote Republican, right? But really what you're doing is you're not practicing the policy of non-engagement. You're not creating consequences. And so evil proliferates. And the same goes for corporations. The same goes for corporations. If you find out that a corporation is engaged in unethical behavior, and you still buy their products and so on, you're allowing evil to proliferate. You're allowing evil to proliferate. And so it's interesting because on one hand, people support evil things, and then on the same side, they wonder like why evil is proliferating, right? It's because we are not withdrawing our support from evil. Okay, we're allowing it to persist. Now, there's a biblical angle to this, which I'll talk briefly about. So within the Bible, and specifically biblical law, there's a certain verse in the book of Deuteronomy, and it says, "Justice, justice you shall pursue, that you may live and inherit the land that God is giving you." Okay. Now, interestingly, justice is repeated twice here. And there's various reasons why it's repeated twice, but it's obvious that the concept of justice is emphasized strongly. And it says, "You shall pursue." Now, interestingly, "you shall pursue" is written in the singular. Okay? So this is not an exhortation to the collective, right? Otherwise, it would be conjugated in the plural. It's conjugated in the singular, which means you must pursue justice. You must pursue justice. Individually, you personally must pursue justice. And from the perspective of biblical law, from the perspective of biblical ethics and so on, ethical conduct is required of all human beings, right? And so when we apply this to what I talked about previously with the philosophy of non-engagement, what that means is you as an individual have to be discerning enough to recognize when somebody or something is evil or behaving in an evil way, and you have to withdraw your support, your money, your friendship, whatever. You have to withdraw your energy. You have to withdraw your energy. And for a lot of people, my personal experience is that a lot of people are unwilling to do this, or there's some kind of psychological block in terms of like fear or whatever that prevents them from cutting off people, politicians, corporations, whatever. Because it's like, okay, I don't like this candidate. We don't really like Kamala Harris, but if we don't vote for her, then the evil orange man will get in. So we have to vote for her, right? It's this logic of if I don't do this, like I have to do this, because if I don't do this, something worse will happen. So I have to tolerate the lesser of two evils, right? When really what biblical law is saying is forget about the lesser of two evils. Do not engage with any evil whatsoever. Don't engage with it, And my experience has been that a lot of people have this attitude of, the lesser of two evils. And they're unwilling or unable, for whatever reason, to separate from evil entirely. And so in biblical ethics, people are commanded to pursue justice individually, with the purchasing decisions that they make, with the voting decisions that they make, the people who they're friends with, the people that they allow into their communities, okay, the people that they hire as employees. All of these things are ethical decisions at the end of the day. And what people have lost sight of, I think, is that the decisions that we make in terms of purchasing, voting, hiring, firing, all of these things, these are fundamentally ethical decisions. They're ethical decisions, and they have real consequences. Because when people tolerate evil, when they hire people that they know aren't good people because they're effective or good salespeople or whatever, when they vote for people that they know aren't good people, when they do all these things, they are allowing evil to proliferate, and they are hurting the good people who are subjected to whatever evil is happening. These have real consequences. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to end with a personal story of something that I experienced. And I'm going to speak in very general terms about this. I'm not going to go deep into the details, but I'm just going to give you kind of a general story and kind of an uplifting takeaway, I think. So about 10 years ago, I was involved as a researcher at a university, and I was studying an experiential learning program at that university. I had been deeply involved with the program. I used to run the program, and then I was tapped as a researcher. And during the course of my research, I did a lot of interviews with the students involved in the program. I think I logged upwards of 40 or 50 hours of interview time. And because of all those interviews I was doing, I was building a lot of relationships with the students who were involved. And in 2018, 2019, I became aware that some things were happening to the female students in the program. There was someone involved in the program who was not treating them in a proper way. And I did a little bit of digging and collected some evidence, and I was satisfied. I was personally satisfied that the disclosures I was receiving were accurate. Now, 2018, 2019 was the height of the Me Too movement, if you remember. This was a huge issue that was happening in a society-wide basis, which was kind of what we're talking about. Complaints about the proliferation of evil and the tolerance of evil and so on. And a big part of the Me Too movement was a move towards zero tolerance, And I was publicly involved with this program. I was seen kind of as the second in command of the program. And so I felt that I had some kind of responsibility for pursuing justice, and preserving safety. And so I went to the professor in charge of this program at this university, and I laid out my concerns and so on, and they weren't taken seriously. I started to crash out a little bit because I was so concerned about the integrity of the program, my professional integrity, and so on, the safety of the students. I was concerned about just the whole situation, and I started to crash out. I got ejected from the community, the program, and the person who there were concerns about and disclosures about remained in the program. And that was the thing that actually got me really thinking about the problem of evil and the problem of the proliferation of evil. Because I could not believe that at the height of the Me Too movement, even then, with all the social pressure, certain decisions were made about not preserving the integrity of the program, not preserving the safety of the female students in the program. I just couldn't believe it. It blew my mind. And I had to spend years researching the psychology of evil to understand what I was dealing with. Okay? Now, unfortunately, I lack the institutional power to bring consequences. I personally am not able to enforce any material consequences on the professor who made certain choices about how he was going to run his program. I lack the ability to bring consequences on the university and the faculty involved in this. There's just one of me, and I feasibly, logistically, I can't do anything about it. However, however, what I did do, one way or another, was withdraw my support from the program. I withdrawed my energy from the program. Partially because I was ejected. I couldn't, you know what I mean? So the choice in some cases was made for me, but I ended up, separating from the program. Now, here's the problem, okay? If you are somebody watching this and you're thinking, my decisions don't matter. If you're thinking, sure, like biblical ethics and philosophical ethics requires me to withdraw my energy and support. I'm just one person. What difference is that going to make? Right? You might be telling yourself that. Like, what difference does my vote make? What difference does me buying from a corporation make? What difference does it make? Okay, because, other people aren't going to follow along. It doesn't make any difference. So, like, you might tell yourself that it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if you make these decisions. But it does. It does. And I'll tell you why. So, as I mentioned, in that whole chronicle of events, I was a researcher. And in that program, I was doing research. And some of the research I was doing was really legitimizing the efficacy of the program in terms of creating learning outcomes for students. And because of everything that happened, that research energy was withdrawn from the program. That research energy was withdrawn from the program. Okay? Now, since 2019, this is what I have done as a researcher. And you can check out my website for more information on this. But this is what I've done since 2019. I've synthesized Jane Loevinger's ego development theory with Abraham Maslow's theory of self-actualization. I've explored how Carl Friston's free energy principle can be applied to social and cultural systems. I've derived intellectual virtues and other elements of morality from Carl Friston's free energy principle. I have developed a conceptual model linking information theory, neuroscience, and the philosophies of aesthetics. I've developed a framework of critical thinking education that emphasizes emotional regulation and intellectual virtues. I've connected ideas in wisdom studies and expertise studies to frame wisdom as generalized life experience and pattern recognition. That's what I've done in psych and neuroscience and social sciences. Within the philosophy of science, I've identified fundamental theoretical issues and deep-seated ideological corruption within psychology. I have connected recent discoveries in physics that suggest our universe is not an isolated system. I've used thermodynamics as an explanatory framework for all human knowledge, including phenomena in sociology, psychology, ethics, and aesthetics. Within history and archaeology, I have explored the negative impacts of industrialization and public education on Western societies. I've identified an oversight in the carbon-14 measurement methodology for Lower Egypt. Within biblical law and theology, I have leveraged blockchain technology to explain Jewish apologetics, specifically the Kuzari principle. I've compiled a list of all commandments contained under the Sheva Mitzvot B'nai Noach, the 7 laws of Noah. I've leveraged principles of game design to develop novel explanations for ideas in Jewish theological works. I've leveraged ideas in thermodynamics and biology to explain the Bible's description of God as a living God. I've leveraged the Gibbs free energy equation to explain biblical concepts of good, evil, blessings, curses, and the Satan. And I've leveraged the concept of quantum superposition to develop a partial explanation for the paradox of free will. I have done all of that within the last 7 years. You may think that your individual choices do not matter. But what I'm illustrating here is that all of that research energy, all of those things that I've done across multiple disciplines, that program that I was involved with could have had that energy. I could have been doing all of that work, expending all of that effort to further the program, to legitimize it, to highlight the learning outcomes. I could have been spending all of that energy within the program. And if these things didn't happen, these incidents didn't happen, I probably would have still been involved with that program. But because of what happened, because I withdrew my energy, They lost out on all of this. They lost out on all of this. Do you understand? Your individual choices matter. Okay? And even if the people that you are withdrawing from are too ignorant and stupid to recognize what they have lost, it doesn't matter. You don't need them to even recognize the invisible consequences and the opportunity costs of their bad behavior. You don't need to. You don't need to. Because justice is its own reward. Because you get to go to bed every night knowing that you withdrew your support from that politician and stood on principle. You withdrew your support from that corporation and stood on principle. You withdrew your support from an organization or a community of people and stood on principle. You get the satisfaction of that. And I'm telling you, it's awfully satisfying. Because while, in my situation, while I lament and grieve the lost opportunities with that program and the friendships that I had and the professional, benefits that I enjoyed, while it does suck to not be part of that anymore, because there was a lot of good. It is awfully satisfying to know that their short-sighted behavior and their lack of commitment to justice and integrity cost them someone like this. It's awfully satisfying. Even if they don't recognize it. Even if none of them ever recognize what they lost, that's okay, because I know. I withdrew my support. I withdrew my energy, my research accomplishments. They get none of it. And that's what I would encourage everyone to do, is stand on principle. Think about places in your life where you're not standing on principle. Think about evil people, politicians, corporations, friends, whatever, that you're tolerating, and separate yourself from it. And if you want to be really brave, tell them why. Tell them why. Oh, why don't we hang out anymore? You've been awfully distant lately. Actually, it's because of X, Y, and Z. Now that you asked, I'll tell you. Okay, and don't do it to punish them or be self-righteous or whatever. Just say, what you're doing, how you're conducting business, whatever, is incompatible with my values. And so you go do your thing, I'm going to go do my thing. That's the philosophy of non-engagement that is advocated for by Atlas Shrugged. It is also the philosophy of non-engagement that is discussed in biblical law and biblical ethics. And it seems to me to be the epitome of the free market in a way, is choosing to do business and have friends based on values and so on. And also, to go back to the original question of why evil proliferates, it proliferates because people do not do things like this. It's because people do not do things like this. You are not willing to cut people off for behaving in an evil way. You are not willing to cut people off for associating with evil. You're not willing to. And that's why evil proliferates, is because we continue feeding it energy. We continue feeding it money, votes, whatever. We continue feeding it, and so it proliferates. And interestingly, the Satan works the same way. When you get deep into Kabbalah and mysticism, you find that the Satan is siphoning energy away from creation by way of people committing sins and so on. At a mystical level, that's how it works. Evil is essentially a parasitic mechanism where it siphons energy away from the good. And the more you allow that siphoning to happen, the more evil is going to proliferate. So the next time you wonder, why do bad politicians consistently get elected? Why are evil corporations running the world? It's because you are not cutting your money off from them. You are not cutting off people who work for, organizations like Palantir or whatever, right? You're not cutting them off. And that's why, is because you're allowing them to siphon your energy, your money, your votes, and so on. So anyway, that is my 30-minute exposition as to why evil proliferates and what you can do about it. And again, if you ever doubt that your individual choices don't matter, think of my story with this program where I was a researcher. They could have had somebody on their side who accomplished all of this in 7 years. And instead, they have nothing. They have nothing except their own iniquity, which they will have to deal with at some point. Anyway, thank you very much for your time. If you're interested in any of the research stuff that I've talked about, you can check out my YouTube channel. I've documented it a lot on there. And my website, zacharystrong.net, has a bunch of papers available for free and a bunch of other resources as well. So thank you very much. Pursue justice, and you will find that justice is its own reward.